Good afternoon, everyone. If you're here for the prioritizing transportation disadvantaged populations, it's going to be starting in 1 minute. Okay, so in 1 minute, I'll let you take over.
And then this is forward backward. Okay. It's within this room too. You want us to talk through the mic? Test. Brad, we're checking your audio. So if you would take yourself off mute and say hello.
Hello, hello.
Yep, a little soft, but I think that's fine.
Okay.
Great. Okay, we are at time, so we're going to get started today. Thank you, everybody, for coming to our session. We have a presentation and hopefully some interaction with you all on prioritizing transportation disadvantaged populations, which is somewhat of a ongoing project and case study of the City of Bend pedestrian implementation plan. So we'll start with some introductions, and we're going to hand it over to Brad to provide a little bit more welcome and start the introduction slide. Brad is joining us from Bend, and there he is. So Brad, take it away.
All right, sounds good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. Appreciate everyone being here today. The three of us are here to present prioritizing transportation disadvantaged populations, as Nick mentioned. Kittleson and Associates and the City of Bend have been working together for close to a year now on this project. And we had three main project purposes or elements that we focused on. The first being to determine areas of greatest need for pedestrian infrastructure in Bend. The second being inventory those areas to identify missing or incomplete infrastructure. And then third, prioritize and create lists of improvement projects needed to create a complete pedestrian network of low-stress facilities. So we'll go into a lot more detail throughout this presentation, talking about those 3 points. But before we do so, we'll just go over a few quick introductions. I'll just begin with myself. As Nick mentioned, I'm Brad Tower with the City of Bend. I'm a project engineer in the Transportation and Mobility Department, and I mainly focus on managing active transportation projects at the city.
And I'm Karen Swirsky. I'm an associate planner at Kittleson and Associates. Previously to that, I worked for the City of Bend for about 7 years, so I kind of initiated this project when I was at the city and was fortunate enough to be able to carry it forward into my consulting life.
And my name is Nick Gross. I'm a transportation planner with Kittleson and Associates as well. I use he, him pronouns, and for this project, I've been wearing several hats, but for the presentation today, I'm mostly going to cover more the analytical methodology and analysis we've been using to prioritize the pedestrian system in Bend. So with that, I think we'll flip back to our presentation. Thank you. And I'm going to give a quick overview for how this presentation is hopefully going to go. We have some project background, which Karen will cover here in a second. Then, as I mentioned, I'm going to mostly cover the analysis, the data we've used, our approach to managing that data, and then really the key task of identifying the high pedestrian needs, or the HPNs, as we call them. And then I think what will be very exciting for you all to see and learn about is the inventory effort of those HPNs, which I think will be unique and hopefully new to most of you. And then Brad will close us out with the project prioritization. A couple pieces to note, or maybe just mainly one. So this whole process that we're going to cover today is really intended to be a framework that you can replicate in your own communities, in your city, as a consultant, as a city planner, and something that we have already found a lot of success in doing. So right before I pass this off to Karen to cover the project background, I did want to do a little bit of a audience exercise to understand who exactly is in the audience. Something I learned this year at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting: instead of raising your hand to identify with the question I'm going to ask, I'd like you to clap. And that was explained as a more inclusive way for someone who may have a visual impairment to understand who is in the audience. So I would like those who identify as city or engineer planners to clap. Okay, I think maybe just one. How about consultants? Okay. How about non-transportation professionals? Okay, all right. Transportation advocates? You can clap for more than one thing. Okay, what am I missing? State staff? And yeah, oh, okay. And how about, just to encompass everyone, people who love riding bikes? Yeah, okay. Great, so now we know a little bit more who we're speaking to. I'm going to give it to Karen to cover some of the project background.
Okay, great.
Oh, wait. Trick. Okay, before we cover the background, I do have some more fun interactive exercises for us all. Can anyone identify what is on the screen? And I will describe what it is in a second here. It is an icebreaker. That's very good. It's a U.S. Coast Guard icebreaker. So that is my way of saying we're going to do a quick, fun, ice-breaking exercise. And I'm going to ask everyone to just speak up and shout out the ideas that come to mind. I'm going to give a couple prompts here. So this exercise is intended to tee up our presentation, but also put you sort of in the seat of the task we've been assigned, both Brad and Karen and myself and the rest of our team. So you are a city planner in city X, and or maybe you're a city engineer. City Council has come to you and they've said, we want to prioritize our pedestrian transportation system, and it really needs to focus on equity, safety, and accessibility. And the process you carry out must be a data-driven process. And let's see what else we have on the prompts. Okay, so the task at hand, you understand the task. And so the question to you all, and I'm hoping people will just shout out, is what data comes to mind in prioritizing pedestrian needs with a focus on equity, safety, and accessibility? So what data sets, real or fake, would you like to use? There is no barrier to accessing these data sets. What data would you find most useful to take on this task for a successful outcome? Bus stop locations, great. What else? Sidewalks, yes, in the back. Corridor demographics, very good. Yes. Immediate data instead of staggered, yep, that's great. An equity lens. Crashes, yep, safety data. Posted speed, yeah. Yes. Senior center, essential destinations, schools, pedestrian travel forecast model. Yes, that would be amazing. It's not too far off from reality, but yeah, that's great. Okay, well, that's all really useful to hear. I think some of that you will see in our presentation. Some of it is not accessible or we were not able to obtain. So anyway, hopefully you are thinking now a little bit closer to our task, and now I actually will pass it over to Karen to provide the project background.
So why do this exercise now? And this has been really an interesting couple of days for me because I've been hearing a lot of work in other cities that echo or make me want to put my hand up and go, but you could do this. So it's sort of interesting couple of days. But the drivers, if you will, behind this project are one is that our council has very strong equity goals. We have a relatively new council, and this diagram you see on there is how they have, that's their forward-facing expression of their goals. So equity is centered. We just finished doing an update of the Bend's transportation plan. It was 20 years old, so it really needed to be updated. It was a big process. It took a couple of years. We had a 25-person advisory committee, many public meetings, many council meetings. But one of the things that came out of it was the understanding that we did not have enough information to do the kind of fine-grained pedestrian project prioritization that the committee in particular wanted to see. Robin Lewis, who is in the audience somewhere there, she had done beautiful work for a bicycle network, but we didn't have the equivalent for a pedestrian network. We did some stopgap stuff in our TSP, which I'm proud of, but is still not the same thing. So pedestrian planning was highlighted in the plan as a follow-on element, and fortunately, there was some money to do it. And then finally, what we heard, what I as a staff member when I was at the city, and what we continue to hear from staff is they would really like to have a transparent and database process for determining where the projects should go. As you all know, as advocates and planners, it's often the loudest voices that get the projects, but not always, those are not always the voices that really need to be served. So we wanted to see if we could use data to call out areas in the city where there was the highest pedestrian need. Not necessarily the loudest voices, sometimes those overlap, but in particular in the city. So it's interesting because we've been hearing a lot about engagement and listening to people. This was kind of a different project in that we wanted to really look hard at the actual data.
Thank you. Excuse me. All right. Okay, so I'm going to walk everyone through the approach we've taken on the technical side of things, and hopefully this is exciting to you as it has been to me. So I'm going to cover the analysis approach, and then talk about how we got to our HPNs, those being our high pedestrian needs. So the approach to our analysis is really sort of anchored on three primary steps. The first being collecting data, and that was essentially us casting as broad of a net as we could to obtain city data, county data, statewide data, transportation system plan data from the city. There's been a lot of previous census data, yes, a lot of previous planning efforts, of course, done in Bend. So everything from transportation safety action plan data, and just really pulling what is available. The next was compiling those data sets and really taking a look at what is relevant to prioritizing pedestrian needs. So some data sets may not be as relevant. They may, for instance, be more relevant to planning for bicycles. So we really wanted to take a look at what is most relevant to pedestrian needs and network planning for pedestrians. And then we migrated all of these different data sets to a single consistent centerline file. And I know that we have a lot of planners and transportation professionals in the room, but I'd like to ask someone to clap if they are not familiar with a centerline file? Okay, I suspected so. So in the planning world, I think I'll go as far to say best practice would be to migrate your data when you're working on network analysis to a centerline file. A centerline file, in short, is a linear reference or spatial reference to a given roadway. So in the city of Bend, every road has a centerline file, and that centerline, in theory, is the actual center of the road. And so a centerline file allows you to assign data attributes to that centerline. Common centerline data attributes would be posted speed, the name of the road, the jurisdictional owner of the road, maybe the average daily volume of the road. And so depending on where you are and what jurisdiction you're working in, that data may be very comprehensive and it may be extremely limited. Maybe it's just the name of the road. And so we took all of these background data sources, the statewide, countywide, citywide, and we essentially join them all to a single center line, which for anyone doing something similar, I would highly suggest this approach. This allows you to have a consistent data set, a single data set, and also allows you to do all of your analysis on a single data set. So that was our next task, and my very creative infographic there on the bottom is my way of trying to show that. And then the last was analyzing our data set. So I'll get more into this in the next couple slides, but in short, we assigned all this data to a center line, and then we worked with the data on a single center line to create essentially the need calculation of these places. I'm going to cover the primary data sets we used. So the first one here, we called this our preliminary base data set, and this kind of encompasses everything. For each slide, you'll see a map on the right side of the screen. The map is illustrating the city of Bend, and the darker lines illustrate the segments or roadways that score higher compared to the lighter line. So when I say score higher, that means that in this case, it may be a safe routes to school road. It may also have a transit route on it, and it may be lacking sidewalks on both sides. That would score, in this case, a dark color, whereas a light color, maybe it has sidewalks on both sides. It doesn't have transit, and it is not a safe routes to school. So these are some of the data sets we worked with. So again, I think there were some themes of what we heard from our clapping or exercise of shouting out: sidewalk inventory, safe routes to school, transit. The next is park walk sheds, safety, and the transportation system key routes. So again, assigning all of these data sets to a single centerline file. And the other piece I'll point out here is that what's common is to have data attributes like posted speed assigned to a centerline file because that is very relevant to a road. Now, if you have a park or a school, that is more of a point on a map data. And so we also assign scores based on the proximity of these locations to the centerline file, so that if you are in, let's say, a half-mile radius of a school, you get 1 point. If you're a quarter mile, if you're closer, you might get 2 points to that segment. So we also assigned point data to our center lines. This next data set is pretty much the core piece of our analysis and prioritization that we leaned very heavily on. And this is what is called the Transportation Disadvantaged Population Index. I suspect some people may be familiar with this. This data set was produced by ODOT in the state and came out probably 3 years ago now, I suspect, maybe 4. It's still extremely relevant. We use it very frequently. And what it includes is elderly populations and youth populations, non-white and Hispanic populations, limited English proficiency populations, low-income households without access to a vehicle, people with a disability, and crowded households. So this is all block level group data. So different than a segment center line, different than a point. We're now talking about sort of census block groups, polygons. Same effort from assigning point data to a centerline data. We also assigned this transportation disadvantaged population index data to our roadway segments. So if the roadway segment was within one of those block groups, it received the score of the TDPI, the Transportation Disadvantaged Population Index. I think I mentioned this already, but this data is publicly available on, I believe this is ODOT's website, or at least a proxy to it through the Kittleson website. So I'm happy to provide access to this. I think you could probably find it by Googling Transportation Disadvantaged Population Index. Again, for those who are looking to replicate this process. Nice. Okay, very good. Yeah, so if this is new to you, I would highly suggest checking it out. Looks like about half the audience already has. And again, there's a little bit of work that might be needed to assign the data to your local jurisdictional streets, the statewide level. This has been done for the entire state. So you can see the block group levels here, and it's also been assigned to state highways. It's very relatively easy to do that same assignment to your local roads. Okay, and the last data set is our housing, employment, and population data set. This was a bit of a proxy for essential destinations and really understanding where people are walking, where the demand is, where people live, where people work, and where those people are trying to get to. And then I think someone in the front row here had mentioned pedestrian destinations. This also included municipal buildings, libraries, parks, schools, etc. Okay, so we have all this data. I'm going to grab some water. And our next step is to overlay these various data sets. So really you can think of this as actually stacking these maps on top of each other and using the darker colored areas, which again are the segments or roadways that are scoring the highest of need, and stacking these data sets on top of each other to then create what we called our system screening analysis of pedestrian needs. So as you can see, on the right side of your screen, there is yet another map, and the darker colors here are what are representing the highest needs of the pedestrian system in Bend. We then took it one step further to identify these HPNs. We had limited scope and budget, as mostly all of your projects do, and we wanted to identify what projects we could do a very detailed data collection on. And so in an effort to do that, we took roughly the top 20% of the segments that scored the highest, with an emphasis on the Transportation Disadvantaged Population Index and the Housing, Employment, and Population data sets. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it to Brad to provide a little bit more context on this process, how it was not entirely data-driven. Can we switch? There he is. Great.
Yeah, exactly. So appreciate it, Nick. So up to this point, as Nick mentioned, we went through a very systematic data-driven approach with this project, yet I think it's still very important to consider the human element to make sure that the data outputs that we're getting actually make sense. So throughout the project, we had multiple opportunities to gather subject matter expertise individuals, if you will, to meet and look over these outputs that Nick came up with as a truth-checking exercise to make sure that we're not getting misled down a path that we shouldn't be going down. So, for example, on the slide that was shown just a moment ago, that was just a couple of pictures of a workshop that we had where we took some photos of these maps that Nick put together. We printed them out, and we all kind of got together around a big round table and just basically thought out loud, wrote any ideas down, just workshopping to make sure that we were heading down the right path. So just as a few examples, one great catch that somebody had was that we had private streets within this data set, and considering this is a city project with public, these would be public improvement projects, that private streets would not be relevant. So that was a great catch. We ended up filtering that out of the data set before rerunning the analysis. And then additionally, there's a lot of really good discussion about, are the areas that were highlighted on the maps, do they make sense to us from a community member who's familiar with the area? And that provided some interesting discussion, because some folks, for example, maybe thought that the safe routes to school data set should have been weighted more heavily, or maybe I think another individual thought a lower income, the lower income community data set should have been weighted more heavily. And ultimately, the approach that we took for this project was, as Nick mentioned earlier, how all the different data sets were contributed to the center line to give the different weightings. We chose to do equal weightings for each data set. And the main justification for that was, this project is somewhat unique to the city. We haven't really taken this approach before. So we think this is a good pilot project, if you will, as like a baseline for a lessons learned type reflection opportunity after we're done with the project. So we've definitely taken the mental exercise and effort to ensure that the maps that we're coming up with are grounded in reality and that they make sense. But we didn't want to push our fingers on the scales too much beyond that, because we think it's much easier to reflect on this project at the end and make tweaks as appropriate with an even baseline, rather than something that already had our user input into that. So, looking forward, that would be something that we could consider, is we could always redo this analysis. And if priorities were to change at the city, or if there was grant opportunities for example, like a Safe Routes to School grant, we could rerun this analysis by ramping up the Safe Routes to School element to really highlight those areas in town that are of higher need. So anyways, just wanted to highlight that this is definitely a data-driven approach, but we still had put a high emphasis on the human truth checking element as well.
Thank you, Brad. I think I've just got one more slide, then I'm going to pass it to Karen, and we're hopeful that we'll have at least 15 or 20 minutes for discussion and questions. So somewhat of the last step in this data-driven approach was, as I mentioned, or where we just left off, identifying the high pedestrian need walk sheds and corridors. So that is, again, the top 20% of the highest needs based on all of those data set overlays. We call them high pedestrian need walk shed and corridors, but we also needed to then figure out exactly what the need was for each of those segments. So the relatively easy part was, when there is not a sidewalk, then the need is to build a sidewalk. The next challenge was, where there are existing sidewalks, how can we figure out what would be needed to improve those if they need to be improved, whether that's widening, or maybe the condition of the sidewalk is very poor, it's not accessible, there are ramps that are not accessible. And so we worked with an outfit called PathView, which I suspect limited people have. Has anyone worked with PathView? No, okay, this is going to be very exciting, and I'm going to pass it off to Karen to take all the excitement. So Karen's, it's pretty cool. All right, Karen's going to take it away with the PathView overview in our next step.
So how many of you have inventories of your sidewalks in your city that tell you anything beyond whether there is one or there isn't one? And well, you're lucky. So the City of Bend knew where all the sidewalks were, but that's all they knew. Yes, no. And as Nick was saying, in order to identify what kind of projects are needed to serve these areas of high pedestrian need, and not just sidewalks, but crossings are really important too. we needed to do some kind of an inventory. Well, one of the people I work with is a complete technology nerd, and he had found out about this company called Pathview. They're back east, and that funny little stroller, which is literally a doggy stroller. I mean, it still has the graphic on the side that says happy puppies. I so wanted them to put up like a stuffed dog in it, but their dignity was enough compromised. And it covers about 2 miles an hour, which is, walking speed, right? And it catalogs the width, the condition, lift, slope, all the ADA concerns. It catalogs what the adjacent, so are they curb tight, are they setback? And it also takes a photo every 10 feet. So once you've done this, you have this record that can, so if in the future you can say, and it could be updated, of course, when you fix the problems. But you can say, why did this segment, when you see the map, which would be show the next map, you see the red, green, blue. There's a one red one there. Why is that red? Well, you can actually access the photos and see. And so it's a really wonderful tool for doing an inventory of something as fine-grained as sidewalks. The range, they do this as, they call it a route accessibility index, and it's from 0 to 100. And you can see there's quite a few green lines on there. That means those sidewalks are in pretty good shape. There's some yellows, and there's one red, and it's an average score for the sidewalk segment. And I think, is Brad gonna? Yeah, so Brad is going to tell us about the cool way you can use this tool.
Yeah, I think this is super cool. So I think most of us are familiar with Google Earth. So Google Earth, you can jump in and have an aerial view of anything on Earth, essentially. And then there's also something called Street View, where you can jump down at the street level, like a human's perspective, to take a look at any imagery where there's data that's been collected. So what's cool about this Pathview data set is you can actually import it into Google Earth, and you can see where all the data was collected, just right there within Google Earth. So in this top image here, I just took a quick screenshot of a few local streets, an aerial image looking down at the City of Bend local streets. And in the previous slide, you saw red, yellow, green, and blue. We decided to just narrow it down to 3 categories, green being compliant sidewalk, red being non-compliant sidewalk, and then yellow is basically kind of in the middle. It might be compliant, but it could be demonstrating some wear. And then if you look at the lower photo, this is a street view. So this is, again, as I mentioned before, yet another example of that human element of confirming the data sets that we're working with are accurate. So if you're to look at this image, it might be a little difficult to see, but working from left to right, there's some sidewalk that is in good condition, which has the actual green line work that was collected superimposed over top of it. And as you progress to the right, there's a few sidewalk panels that are broken, and there's red line work there. So this is just yet another opportunity for us to have a human element sanity check to make sure that the data we're getting is accurate. All right, so before I jump into this, I just really want to quickly circle back to my initial points here, just to kind of keep things, the big perspective in mind. So I mentioned that there are 3 areas of focus in this project. The first is determine areas of greatest need for pedestrian infrastructure in Bend. That's what Nick was describing with all those different data sets, highlighting the we call them HPN, high priority need or high pedestrian needs. Second was inventory those areas to identify missing or incomplete infrastructure. That's what we just covered with the Pathview element. But now the third element is to narrow things down even further to talk about prioritization of all this data that we've narrowed down. So starting with the image in the top left there, this is just one of many examples, but this is one of the outputs that Nick put together with his model. And we focused on 2 main elements. One is sidewalk segments, and the other being pedestrian intersections or crossings. And so the left image there is an example of an output that we were looking at sidewalk segments. And we came up with yet another prioritization metric where we have roughly 3 tiers for both the sidewalk segments and the pedestrian crossings. And areas, so for example, the criteria we came up with, but these are all subject to, various inputs or opinions. With the sidewalk segments, we prioritize the highest segments in the high priority areas. Areas where there's missing sidewalk on both sides were the highest of priorities. And then, areas with one side of sidewalk that exists would be a lower priority. And then it basically subsequently decreases from there. And then the pedestrian crossings, kind of a similar approach, but we factored in various data sets there. So we looked at crossings that had a speed of 30 miles per hour or greater, vehicular speed that is, and then looked to see if that crossing was on a safe routes to school route or a key route. And that's something that the City of Bend established previously in the transportation system plan. A key route is one of the primary pedestrian or bicycling routes around town that have been previously established. So with those, we then come to yet a closer step to coming up with a prioritized list. So the next image in the slide there in the bottom right, on the previous slide actually, but the bottom right image, thank you, is so we're looking at an example here of the pink line was I believe that's a tier 2 project on Neff Road, and that's because there's a sidewalk gap on the north side of the street there. And then additionally, you can see 2 intersections or pedestrian crossings. One is blue and the other is green. The blue one would be considered tier 1. That's because that was also on a safe routes to school segment, as well as a key route for the city. And the green one was a lower tier because I believe it's just on I believe that's just part of a safe routes to school. So essentially what we have here, we have to piece all these together. There's a lot around the city, but we're looking for areas where there's going to be segments of sidewalk gaps of the highest priority that are adjacent to pedestrian crossings of the highest priority, as well as factoring in that path view data set to see, are there any existing sidewalk panels that are non-compliant? And then we kind of package all these different areas around town to highlight potential projects that the city can identify. So going to the next slide, this is just for visual representation. The potential improvement projects would be taking an existing condition that might look like the top left image there, where we're looking at an intersection that has missing sidewalk on one side, as well as no additional pedestrian amenities for the crossing, to once that project has been identified, if future funding becomes available, ultimately, ideally, it would look something a little similar to the image in the bottom right. So continuous sidewalk on both sides of the street, pavement markings for the crossing, as well as potentially a pedestrian refuge island, as well as accompanying signage. So I think that this is where we're at with the project right now. We are not done with the project prioritization. We actually have another team meeting here this week to kind of go over the methodology that we had, make sure there's no elements that we're missing. But what I find interesting about this is, this is, again, kind of a pilot project. So it's an opportunity, looking at next steps. The next slide here is, we view this as like a living data set or model that we can work with over time. So although that with this project, we had certain criteria that we're looking to meet, as we mentioned before, that we gave equal weightings to all the different data sets. We came up with our own project prioritization methodology. There's more opportunity in the future to, if we ever need to tweak any of the data, or not the data, but how the model is produced based on, for example, I used the example of the Safe Routes to School grant. If for some reason we had funding become available and wanted to provide a higher priority to a certain project type, we could rerun the model to kind of output something more visually to highlight the areas around town that we that we can improve. So the end goal of this project is essentially for the city to have a ready to go list, such that if funding were to become available for projects, and or if there are existing projects that are adjacent to some of these areas, we have the context and a visual reference to look at and say, oh, these sidewalks are deficient. Can we expand the scope of an existing project that's adjacent to that? Or if there are funding opportunities, okay, we just got funding. how do we know where around town that money should go? We now have a good basis to refer to allocate those resources. So yeah, and I think Karen maybe had something in addition to that as well.
Well, the last thing I was going to say, because I'm a planner, I'm excited about this tool. How many of you are familiar with the new climate-friendly and equitable rules that have just come out of DLCD? So you know, yeah, but you know that that part of the new rules requires a much more extensive pedestrian inventory and also has a very strong equity approach overlay on it. And I'm thinking this tool is going to be useful for other cities now that we've kind of ironed out some of the bugs, to do this kind of prioritization and identification of the areas of highest need based on data, transparent process. Your city councilor comes to you and say, why'd you pick that project? You can say, this is why. So I'm excited about it as a tool. And I have to say, the last thing is, this was kind of my idea, but I had no idea how to make it real. And Nick has done that. And so it's very exciting to me to see these maps and see this process go forward. So I think questions now.
Yes, we have time for questions. I should know this. Do we end at 4:15 or 4:30? 4:30. Okay, we have, yeah, we have 20 minutes for questions. Sometimes they bring a mic around, but why don't you, oh, okay. Oh, there's some questions in the chat too. Or comments. While we pull that up, why don't we start in the back of the room here? I think those are live too. Maybe we don't want to come too close to each other.
Is this working? Oh, it is.
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much and congratulations on making that a reality because that's a really awesome tool. I was just wondering if you receive, I guess, any instances of people not believing the data and how that's grappled with. I know in my advocacy life, if simply the fact that there's data that streets are deadly, if that worked, I would be out of a job. But yeah, I was wondering how that is grappled with.
I can take a stab at that. So I think as Karen mentioned, the TSP process did a very in-depth and inclusive public outreach process. This planning effort has been much more data-driven, as you mentioned, but also a bit, it's focused more on city staff input and comment. So again, there was the need and public process identified as part of the TSP. This tool has not been rolled out to the public for their feedback. However, the work sessions that Brad mentioned earlier, that more human factor to sort of gut checking the data, has definitely made us pivot in some ways, also relying on what the most relevant data is, and so maybe not so much believing it's true or false data, but somewhat adjusting the data to better fit the needs of the city of Bend. The one other thing I'll say as an example is we initially used the statewide pedestrian safety risk calculation, which considered, I believe it was greater than or equal to 4-lane roads as one of the many factors of risk. And in Bend, there are very few 4-lane roads and that belong to the city, right? So we essentially, we're able to make these smaller adjustments to fit the context of the community, the place that we were working in, but still sort of maintaining the core principles of these broader data sets.
So what Nick didn't finish was because I interrupted you. What we chose was roads that had a posted speed of over 30 miles an hour instead of number of lanes because of that differentiation. I think probably the biggest question has not been to doubt the data itself. It's been more, do we want to turn the dial? So, and we had a lot of robust discussion of that among when we had our workshop. It's like, should we emphasize safe routes to school? Should we put more emphasis on disadvantaged communities? And we basically wound up with something that's kind of steady state, sort of equal. That's not to say, like Brad was mentioning, that if the city really wanted to know where its highest priority projects are for a safe routes to school grant, they couldn't crank that dial, and the map would show that to them. So there's an opportunity to use this tool to match projects to funding, which I think is also quite exciting.
I also mind jumping in on it as well. I think it's a great question because I think sometimes folks can put too much weight on data or a model that's output. And we've had a lot of these. We didn't really maybe capture it very well in the presentation, but a lot of discussion. And I was actually one of the big cheerleaders for that throughout the project, just to really challenge ourselves to make sure that it's we don't blindly just trust the model outputs and just kind of do the mental sanity checks to see if it makes sense. I don't think no matter what, when you're creating a model, it's not necessarily going to be perfect because it's the constraints that you're putting on it aren't necessarily perfect either. So I think we took the two-pronged approach of we're not going to put any additional emphasis in terms of, like Karen was describing, on the weights of the different the data inputs. This is more of a pilot project to kind of reflect back on and say, how did that model work? Does it make sense? And throughout the project, we have found that the output does make sense. However, there are some areas that raise some question marks, especially for me, and everyone has different backgrounds and different training. So, and you bring that in with you when you're reviewing like a model's output. So for me, I've been heavily trained on, pedestrian amenities. What's the point? We're connecting people to places. So there's a few areas around town that are actually in our areas of high pedestrian need. Where originally at first thought, when looking at it, it didn't seem to me that should score as highly as it did as other areas. However, we have to also keep in mind, there's a lot of different factors playing into this project that maybe don't play into your standard project, which is there's that big emphasis on equity, on disadvantaged populations. And when considering that, I had to kind of look at things through a slightly different lens and realize, okay, maybe these neighborhoods aren't adjacent to a shopping center. However, they are adjacent to like a bus stop or like certain amenities that maybe you don't use, but other areas in the community or other people in the community might heavily rely on. So it's a good question. It's not something that there's like a clear answer for, but it's one of those that throughout the process, we definitely had mental checks and we stayed our assumptions throughout the project such that if it comes under further scrutiny at a later date, as Karen mentioned, we know exactly what we did and why we did it. And if there's critiques that we need to make or want to make, we have the ability to do so.
I have a follow-up question sort of along these same lines. So on the one hand, you talk quite a lot how this is data-driven, and then Brad, you, I think quite rightly noted that equally weighting something or weighting data points is minimally is an ethical question about how important is that to whatever outcome you're interested in, as well as picking which data points matter, right? Those are not specifically sort of scientific questions. They're weighted with your ethical judgments. I'm just wondering about other kind of data that you might use either to refine or to reflect on this. So I'm just wondering if you've considered either using some sort of doing like focus groups or even survey data to have people sort of to hear from your community about these were our judgments about what mattered. What did folks actually in the community think about this?
Yeah, Karen, did you want to jump? I'm happy to jump in. I see you with the mic, so I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah, let me just think about how to answer that without getting myself in trouble. That's a really good question, and it's a tricky question. So as Nick mentioned, during the update of the transportation plan, we had a really extensive public engagement process. That's not saying that was adequate for this project. In a city like Bend, historically, when we have done that kind of outreach, you hear the loudest voices. So the folks that show up for the focus groups, the folks that fill out the survey, are the folks that are used to that kind of communication. I think if we go forward with any kind of a public outreach for this, it would be a different model than what the city has historically used. But we wanted to start with the data. And I don't know, Brad, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think those are really good points, and definitely it was considered, but when we actually, it might take our group a little while to recall this because this was like at the very beginning of the project, when kind of filtering through the data that we had, and did we have quality data or data that was kind of lacking. And we actually do have two formal opportunities for citizens to provide input to the city. So one of them is like a citizen service request. That's a little more broad. It can be a lot of different things. And another is called a barrier removal request. So if there's somebody who lives in a particular area of town and they recognize like, hey, I take this route every day and there's a segment of sidewalk missing, they can report that to the city. It gets uploaded to a map that we have. So it's kind of a living document for those deficiencies around town. We definitely wanted to incorporate that into our data set for the project. But when we looked at the data, we recognized that was just not a well-managed data set at the city currently. And so that was kind of a lesson learned for us is, and a great point as a question there is, I think going forward, we could put a little more emphasis into managing that data set, because I think that's a good opportunity to collect input from the community of, we as a community or we as city staff, we feel like we have a pretty good feel for what's going on around town, yet there's still a lot of things that we don't recognize. If there's areas around town we're not familiar with, or if we don't live there, that the community can provide input on. But I do think it's still worth, again, that's not perfect either, as Karen mentioned, because sometimes it's the loudest voices that get heard, but maybe not the most important issues that are communicated to the city. So it's definitely a balancing act, but it is something we considered. We looked at the data set that we had, and unfortunately at that time when we got this project kickstarted, it was lacking. But I think kind of a lesson learned for this project going forward would be maybe to keep that data set a little more up to date and accurate, such that, for future iterations, we could incorporate community feedback into how we rank, issues that are around town.
And I also think the place for the kind of community engagement that I'm thinking of is really at the project level. So we're figuring out where projects are needed, but the actual project and design, those folks who will be using it are probably the folks that we want to talk to, if that makes sense.
Hi. First off, awesome presentation. Thank you. I really enjoyed listening. I do have a question, but before I get to that, I can't help it but address that last question, because by pure coincidence, I'm presenting tomorrow on an uncannily similar project to this one. Yeah, great minds think alike. So Jess Deb, when she was with Tool Design, and I worked on a metro prioritization exercise, and we actually did do focus groups that were BIPOC specific because of that issue of the loudest voices. So we had a couple of focus groups of 100 non-white folks giving input into our process. So I'd encourage anyone interested to show up tomorrow afternoon. We'll be presenting that. But my question, maybe I missed this, but I know they're not in the city's jurisdiction for the most part, but they are part of the network. Off-street trails, were those included?
In short, no. Trails were not included. We primarily used essentially a roadway data set, which had the sidewalk inventory and a lot of great data as our starting point. We did not look at trails. And I'm going to suspect, and maybe Brad can chime in a little bit more, I think that might be a little bit just by how money trickles down from prioritizing sidewalk infill and sidewalk improvement projects versus trails?
Actually, no. It was because we actually did a pretty complete trails mapping and analysis and crossings for the transportation plan. So that was, yeah, it's okay, you can be wrong.
Brad, do you have anything to add?
Nothing major, just something to consider that almost similar to some of the private roads. A lot of the trails around town aren't city managed, or it's kind of a hybrid between maybe there's easements, some of it's owned by Ben Park, some of it's the Old Mill District. Some trails are intended to be ADA compliant, others are just dirt or gravel trails that are multi-use for pedestrians and bicyclists. And so I think it may be worth considering, in the future in another iteration. But for this project, considering it's a little messy knowing who owns what and where, and a lot of times it's very sporadic. That creates a challenge. And then additionally, we were really focused on compliant sidewalks that are accessible. And with this project, or with many, trails around town, they don't even tend to be accessible, if you will. Now, I do think that's an interesting point, though, to maybe consider going forward or looking at the crossings. The crossings would more than likely be crossing a city facility or a city street, and that probably was not weighed into our prioritization of pedestrian crossings. And thinking about that, I think that's a good point to maybe make a note of that. If we were to run another iteration of this, I don't know if we would look extensively at trails just with all the factors I mentioned there, but the crossings I think would maybe be worth taking a look at, considering those are usually high use facilities.
Hi.
Let's take this one first, and then if we have
Hi.
time.
Yeah, I'm Shelley from Washington County, and we've kind of done something similar. And I was just wondering how you translate it into actual projects, because what we found is it's all how you define the segments, and sometimes what the highest PED need is for a sidewalk, but it also needs a bike lane and it needs other things. And so that means a complete street project versus where can you just do sidewalk infill, or whether it's maintenance. There's different types of projects that come out of this kind of prioritization, and how do you tackle it, when maybe a complete street project is 15 years, 20 years off. Do you spend money to do sidewalk even though you're not meeting the bike need on that roadway? Or you have a whole corridor, do you pick off just a small section? How do you pick off a small section to try to complete? Does this prioritization help you pick that off when maybe the whole thing is, orange? Like, how do you translate this into actual projects? And that's probably the next step that you're probably talking about. I want to kind of like to understand what you guys are thinking about and how to do that.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, and Brad, you can chime in some more as well. So yes, this is kind of right in the middle of where we're at with the project now. One thing we haven't mentioned yet is the list of projects that we are now in a draft form are not prioritized. So we have, close to 60 or so projects. They're all highly prioritized, but they're not prioritized in a numerical list. So as certain funding becomes available, there's certain projects that are just better, apt to fit in that. In terms of the actual selection of the projects, whether it's a 50-foot sidewalk infill or 2 blocks with a RFB crossing, that has been probably the most quantitative human factor effort of our planning process so far. We have had a couple work sessions with city staff on looking at the output of the data and then manually going through each of these segments to understand if there's a planned project for them, if it's a sidewalk infill on one side of the road or both sides of the road, and then looking at all these different needs overlaid, what makes sense to tie, the sidewalk infill, and there's a crossing, crossing need 50 feet away, just lumping things sort of together to create projects, as well as the data set that looks at low or poor sidewalk condition data. So it's been it's been a bit of a human touch to sort of project selection, but all based on data.
I'm sure Brad has more to say, but the two things that also feed into that are, as I mentioned earlier, is the Bend has an adopted low-stress bikeway network. So I think that would be a consideration if the sidewalk project were, on one of those identified. It also has had for a very long time a complete streets policy. So if we're going to build a new street or a new corridor, it's going to have the whole, deal. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but Brad, did you want to say something?
Sure, yeah, it's definitely a great question. I'll just say for this project, ideally we're considering things like mobilization and what would make sense for a project. Like, it's somewhat arbitrary where the limit's drawn, and we try to think about the constructability, the cost. You wouldn't have one project be a sidewalk in one area of town and then another one in another area of town. It's just not as cost effective. We think about things like mobilization and whatnot for a contractor. So that plays into it in terms of trying to draw nice clean lines around the extents of what a project limit would be. However, I think it's good to note that I think this prioritization is still at a relatively high level. I would say it maybe gets you like 80% of the way there. So in the nature of the question, we're not getting down quite to the nitty gritty of, okay, now that we've determined that we're going to actually do this project, we probably wouldn't do it in a vacuum, right? So that was a great point, that if you're going to do a sidewalk improvement, are there bike lanes? Is it, is it something that you'd like to make it into a complete street? So on a previous slide, I showed like kind of that segment with there's crossings that needed to be improved and that segment of sidewalk that's missing. I think that we can prioritize the project at face value at a very high level based on the how we prioritized or what we thought were important for prioritizing our projects. But it's certainly not a be all end all. This would be something that is taking us maybe to like the 80% mark. And then if funding were to become available, or if there was an adjacent project that there was funding for, that would definitely need to be revisited and looked at with a closer eye. I would not say this project gets us to an all-inclusive final project with an exact, we have broad cost estimates for a handful of projects that we'll determine as like the highest of priorities. But it's slightly outside the scope of this project to kind of look at the ripple effects, which anybody that's worked in a city or whatnot realizes when you're working with existing infrastructure, there's always that ripple effect. It's very hard to kind of draw the start and finish lines. If you get into one thing, it usually affects other things. So good question. I don't know if we'd necessarily give you the best answer for it, but I would just say conceptually, this effort probably gets you to roughly the 80% mark, so that it's for the city to have much more context as far as how they allocate resources and funding to various projects. But there still needs to be that diligent, whoever's like the project manager of an individual project needs to look at it and say, okay, if we're going to tear up the asphalt or put in a sidewalk, are there other improvements that need to be made? And that would have to be made at, each respective time when that project kind of comes to life. So hopefully that provides a little context there.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to cut you guys off, but thank you, Nick, Karen, and Brad. The next presentation here will be Blazing the Trail for Low and Zero Emission Transit in Oregon at 4:45.